Eleanor Vance had decided, with the quiet finality of a closing door, that she would ruin her own life before she allowed another to do it for her. It was a small, cold comfort, a single flickering candle in the vast, echoing darkness of her future. Tonight, at the Duchess of Pemberley's annual ball, she would do something unforgivable. Something that would make her unmarriageable, a pariah, a ghost to be whispered about but never seen. It was a better fate than the one her father had arranged. Her reflection in the gilded mirror of the retiring room was a stranger's. A pale face, eyes the color of a winter sky, framed by hair that refused to hold a fashionable curl. She wore a gown of pale blue silk, a hand-me-down from a more fortunate cousin, its fabric whispering of dances and flirtations she had never known. At 23, she was firmly on the shelf, a forgotten book gathering dust. Until now. Now, she was a commodity, the last remaining asset of a family drowning in debt. Her father, a man whose kindness had been eroded by desperation, had made the arrangement last week. His words had fallen like stones into the frozen pond of her resignation. Lord Ashworth, a man twice her age, with a wet mouth and eyes that stripped a woman of her dignity from across a room. He would pay their debts. He would save their name. In return, he would own her. A tremor ran through her hands, and she tightened her grip on the reticule hanging from her wrist. Inside, nestled beside a lace handkerchief, was a small flask of her father's cheapest brandy. It was the cornerstone of her plan, a desperate, clumsy tool for a desperate, clumsy rebellion. She would make a scene, a drunken, hysterical scene. Society would be appalled. Lord Ashworth would be horrified. Her father would be furious. But she would be free. It was a scorched earth sort of freedom, but it was the only kind left to her. She stepped back into the ballroom, the heat and noise of physical assault. Hundreds of candles blazed in crystal chandeliers, casting a brilliant, unforgiving light on the swirling dancers. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax, perfume, and wilting hopes. Laughter died like a candle running out of air whenever she passed. She was Lady Eleanor Vance, the spinster, the bargain bin bride. She could feel their pity, their condescension, like a suffocating shroud. She found a secluded alcove behind a wilting potted palm, the perfect vantage point for her impending social suicide. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was it, the precipice. She had only to take that final step. Her fingers fumbled with the clasp of her reticule, searching for the cold, hard courage of the flask. But then, a change rippled through the room. It was not a sound, but a sudden absence of it. The music faltered. Laughter caught in throats. The sea of dancers parted as if commanded by an unseen force. Eleanor peered around the palm frond, her own desperate plan forgotten. He stood in the grand archway, a figure carved from shadow and ice. Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood. He was a man spoken of in hushed, fearful tones. The Iron Duke. Impossibly wealthy, ruthlessly powerful, and utterly unreadable. He never attended such frivolous events. His presence here was as shocking as snow in July. He was dressed in stark, unforgiving black, a stark contrast to the colourful silks and satins of the other gentlemen. His face was all sharp angles and severe lines, his dark hair untouched by powder. But it was his eyes that held the room captive, dark, chillingly intelligent, and utterly devoid of warmth. They swept the room once, a brief, dismissive assessment, before landing, inexplicably, on her father. The Duke moved with a predatory grace, cutting a straight path through the gawking aristocrats. He did not acknowledge anyone. He did not smile. He simply advanced, his purpose a tangible thing in the suddenly cold air. He stopped before her father, a man now visibly trembling, his face ashen. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, She was too far to hear, but she could see the rigid set of the Duke's jaw, the slight, almost imperceptible nod he gave. Her father, looking utterly bewildered, nodded back. The Duke's gaze then moved, a slow, deliberate turn of his head, and found her. For a single, terrifying second, the entire glittering ballroom ceased to exist. There was only the weight of his stare. It was not like Lord Ashworth's leering gaze, nor was it the pitying glance of others. It was something else entirely. It was intense, analytical, as if he were memorizing every line of her face, every frayed thread on her borrowed gown. Then, just as quickly, he turned and was gone, melting back into the shadows from which he had come. The ballroom erupted in a frenzy of whispers. The music stuttered back to life, but the spell of the evening was broken. Eleanor felt a chill creep over her skin that had nothing to do with the draft from the terrace doors. A few moments later, her father was at her side, his hand gripping her elbow with bruising force. "Come," he said, his voice a raw, shaky whisper. "We are leaving." He did not speak again until they were in the rattling carriage, her mother weeping softly into a handkerchief beside them. He stared out at the dark streets of London, his profile etched with a mixture of terror and disbelief. "The arrangement with Lord Ashworth is off," he finally said, his voice hollow. A fragile, treacherous hope fluttered in Eleanor's chest. Had her silent prayers been answered? Had some divine intervention saved her? "The Duke of Blackwood," her father continued, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "He has offered to settle all our debts, every last one." Her mother let out a small gasp. "Baron, what does he want in return?" Her father turned his gaze from the window to Eleanor. His eyes were filled with a terrible, bleak finality. "He wants your hand in marriage." The hope in Eleanor's chest died, instantly and violently. A cold dread, far worse than anything she had felt for Lord Ashworth, washed over her. The Iron Duke, a man who did not speak, did not smile, did not feel. She had not been saved. She had been sold to a higher bidder. The flask in her reticule felt impossibly heavy, a monument to a rebellion that had never even begun. The wedding was a swift, bloodless affair. It took place in a cold, echoing chapel with only her parents and the Duke's solicitor as witnesses. The Duke stood beside her, a silent statue in dark grey. He did not look at her. His vows were spoken in a low, toneless voice, a contractual obligation met. When he slid the plain gold band onto her finger, his touch was cold and impersonal, the briefest brush of skin against skin. There was no kiss. There was no celebration. She was now the Duchess of Blackwood, a title that felt as alien and ill-fitting as the heavy silk of her new gown. Blackwood Manor was less a home than a monument to solitude. It was a vast, Gothic structure of grey stone that seemed to consume the light. Inside, cavernous rooms were filled with furniture, shrouded in white dust cloths. The silence was absolute, broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the main hall, and the soft, ghostly footsteps of the skeletal staff. Her husband was a phantom. He had installed her in a suite of rooms in the East Wing, far from his own in the West. They saw each other only at dinner, a torturous ritual conducted in a dining hall that could have seated 50. They sat at opposite ends of a long, polished mahogany table, the distance between them a vast, unbridgeable chasm. He never spoke. He would eat with a disciplined, mechanical precision, his eyes fixed on some point beyond her shoulder. Eleanor found she could not swallow past the lump of anxiety in her throat. She would push the food around her plate until the silent butler came to clear it away. Her days fell into a monotonous, suffocating rhythm. She would wake, dress, and wander the cold, silent halls of her prison. She had brought with her only 2 personal possessions: a small collection of books, and her sketchbook. The books were her escape, the sketchbook her solace. She had always found a quiet joy in drawing, particularly in the intricate, delicate details of flowers and plants. Here, in the manicured but lifeless gardens of Blackwood Manor, she would sit for hours, trying to capture the fragile beauty of a rose or the stubborn tenacity of ivy clinging to a stone wall. It was the only thing that made her feel real. One afternoon, a week into her new life, she left her sketchbook on a garden bench. She didn't realize it was missing until the next morning, and a cold panic seized her. That book contained the only part of her that was truly her own. To have him find it, to have his cold, dismissive eyes scan her private, foolish drawings, felt like a violation. She searched the gardens frantically, but it was gone. She dreaded dinner that evening more than ever, certain he would mention it, perhaps with a cruel, cutting remark about her childish pastime. But he said nothing. He was as silent and remote as ever. The sketchbook, it seemed, had simply vanished. 2 weeks later, a young footman approached her as she was taking her morning constitutional in the garden. He bowed stiffly. "His Grace requests your presence, Your Grace," he mumbled, his eyes fixed on the gravel path. Her heart began to pound. It was the first time he had ever requested her presence for anything. She followed the footman through the labyrinthine corridors to a part of the estate she had not yet explored. He stopped before a heavy oak door and, with another bow, departed, leaving her alone. Her hand trembled as she reached for the iron handle. What could you want? To finally tell her the terms of her imprisonment? To outline her duties as the Duchess he had purchased? She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was warm and humid, thick with the scent of damp earth and living things. Sunlight streamed through a ceiling made entirely of glass panes, illuminating a space filled with green. It was a conservatory. But it was not just any conservatory. It was filled with tables and shelves, all laden with potted plants. There were orchids with petals like painted silk, ferns with delicate feathery fronds, and flowering vines she had only ever seen in illustrations. In the center of the room, on a simple wooden easel, sat her sketchbook, open to a detailed drawing of a wild orchid. Beside it, on a small table, was a brand new set of drawing pencils and fine, creamy paper. Eleanor stood frozen in the doorway, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. There was no note, no explanation. Just this silent, overwhelming gesture. She walked slowly into the room, her fingers trailing over the velvety leaf of a begonia. She picked up her sketchbook. It was undamaged. Someone had simply found it and returned it. But this room, this had been built for her. He had seen her drawings, understood her quiet passion, and had given her this sanctuary. The Iron Duke, the cold, ruthless man she had married, had done this. The knowledge was a crack in the icy facade of her resignation. It did not make sense. A man who bought a wife as a business transaction did not build her a private world for her hobbies. It was a puzzle, and for the first time since her arrival, a flicker of curiosity stirred within her. Who was Alistair Beaumont? That evening at dinner, she dared to look at him, truly look at him, for the first time. She searched his face for some sign, some clue to the man behind the mask. But there was nothing. His expression was as impassive as ever. "Thank you," she said, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the cavernous room. His eyes lifted from his plate and met hers. There was a flicker of something in their dark depths. Surprise, perhaps? He gave a single, curt nod, and then his gaze dropped back to his plate. The wall of silence was back in place. But Eleanor knew now that it was a wall. And walls, she knew from her study of ivy, could have cracks. Their first public appearance as a married couple was a dinner party hosted by the Earl of Danbury. Eleanor dreaded it. She knew she would be the main attraction, the subject of every whispered conversation. The plain spinster who had somehow snared the untouchable Duke of Blackwood. She dressed with care, choosing a simple gown of deep emerald velvet. It did little to make her feel confident. As she descended the grand staircase, she saw him waiting in the foyer. He was watching her, his expression unreadable as always. But his gaze was intent. For a moment, she felt a strange warmth spread through her chest. Then he looked away, and the moment was gone. The carriage ride was silent. The air between them was thick with unspoken things. He did not look at her, but she felt his presence beside her, a solid, unyielding force. It was not comforting, but it was substantial. The Danburys' home was ablaze with light and sound. The moment they were announced, a hush fell over the room. Every eye turned to them. Eleanor's fingers tightened into fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. She could feel the weight of their scrutiny, their judgment. She felt her husband shift slightly beside her, a subtle movement, but she sensed it was a deliberate placement of himself between her and the worst of the stairs. The evening was an ordeal. She endured the thinly veiled questions, the false smiles, the condescending pleasantries. The women assessed her gown, her jewels, her very existence, and found her wanting. The men looked at the Duke with a mixture of awe and fear, and at her with utter bafflement. It was Lady Isabel Finch who finally gave voice to the malice that hung in the air. Lady Isabel was a celebrated beauty, a diamond of the first water, who had once made it her public ambition to become the next Duchess of Blackwood. His Grace's sudden marriage to a nobody like Eleanor had been a bitter, public humiliation for her. She cornered Eleanor near the refreshment table, her smile as sharp and beautiful as a shard of glass. "My dear Duchess," she purred, her voice carrying just enough to be overheard by those nearby. "One must congratulate you. It is not every day a lady of modest means manages to secure such a spectacular prize. You must tell us all your secret. Was it cleverness, or simply desperation?" The insult was clear. The implication that Eleanor had trapped the Duke into marriage. A hot flush of shame and anger rose in Eleanor's cheeks. She opened her mouth to reply, though she had no idea what she would say. But her voice, low and cold as the grave, cut through the air behind her. "The only secret, Lady Isabel," the Duke said, "is why you imagine your opinion to be of any consequence." Eleanor had not even heard him approach. He stood directly behind her, a towering, menacing presence. The small circle of listeners gasped. Lady Isabel's perfect smile faltered, her face paling. The Duke's eyes were like chips of flint. He took a deliberate step forward, forcing Lady Isabel to take a step back. "My wife's presence is the only prize in this room," he continued, his voice dangerously soft. "And it is a prize you will never be worthy of. Now, if you will excuse us, the air in this corner has grown rather stale." He placed a hand on the small of Eleanor's back, a firm, possessive pressure that sent a jolt through her. He guided her away from the stunned silence of the crowd, leaving Lady Isabel standing there, utterly humiliated. He did not release her until they were in a deserted corridor. He dropped his hand, as if her dress had burned him. He turned to her, his face a mask of cold fury. "Are you unharmed?" he asked, his voice clipped. Eleanor could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. She was shaking, not from fear, but from a dizzying mix of emotions. She had been insulted, yes, but she had also been defended, fiercely, publicly. The Iron Duke, who cared for nothing and no one, had just socially eviscerated one of the most powerful belles of the ton for her sake. "Good," he said, his jaw tight. "We are leaving." The ride home was even more silent than the ride there, but the silence had changed. It was no longer empty. It was charged, heavy with the aftershock of his actions. Eleanor stole glances at him. He stared out the window, his profile rigid, but she saw the muscle jumping in his jaw. He was not calm. He was furious. But his fury had been on her behalf. The puzzle of her husband grew more complex, more maddening. These acts of quiet consideration, the conservatory, this public defense, they were at war with the cold, distant man who shared her name but not her life. She felt as though she were living with two different people, the silent, remote Duke and a hidden, fiercely protective stranger. And she was beginning to fear that it was the stranger who was capturing her unwilling heart. The following week, her mother came to call. It was a visit Eleanor had been dreading. Her mother swept into the grand, cold drawing room of Blackwood Manor, her eyes wide, taking in the opulent but cheerless surroundings. "Oh, my dear," she began, her voice a fretful whisper as soon as the maid had closed the door. "This house, it is so vast. Are you well? You look pale." "I am perfectly well, Mama," Eleanor replied, her voice stiffer than she intended. Her mother twisted a lace handkerchief in her hands. "The Duke. We hear such stories. They say what he did to poor Isabel Finch at the Danbury party was monstrous. He has ruined her season. Her family is mortified." "Lady Isabel was insulting," Eleanor said quietly. "He was defending my honor." "Yes, but so brutally," her mother fretted. "Eleanor, you must be careful. A man like that, he is not a gentleman. You must try to please him, to soften him. It is a wife's duty to create a warm and pleasant home." She looked around the cavernous, silent room. "You have not done much of that here, have you?" The words, meant as concern, felt like a judgment. Eleanor was a failure as a commodity. She had been purchased to provide a service, to be a pleasing wife, and she was failing. The familiar feeling of powerlessness washed over her. "I do not know how to please him, Mama," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "I do not know him at all." "You must try, child," her mother urged, "for all our sakes." After her mother left, a cold despair settled back over Eleanor. Her brief flicker of curiosity about her husband was extinguished by the chilling reminder of her role. She was a transaction. His defense of her was not about her, but about his possession. Lady Isabel had insulted his property, and he had reacted accordingly. The conservatory was likely just an indulgence for a prized mare, a way to keep his investment placid. That night, she couldn't sleep. The silence of the manor pressed in on her. Restless, she slipped out of her room and wandered the moonlit corridors. She found herself drawn to the west wing, his wing, a part of the house she had never dared to enter. A sliver of light shone from beneath the door of what she assumed was his study. Drawn by an impulse she didn't understand, she crept closer. The door was slightly ajar. She peered through the narrow opening. Alastair sat at a massive desk, but he wasn't working. He was slumped in his chair, a half-empty glass of brandy in his hand, staring into the dying embers of the fire. The severe control he usually maintained was gone. In the flickering firelight, the Iron Duke looked broken. His face was etched with a profound loneliness, a weariness so deep it seemed to weigh down his very bones. Her heart constricted. This was not the cold, unfeeling automaton she saw at dinner. This was not the ruthless enforcer who had silenced Lady Isabel. This was a man utterly alone, drowning in a silence even more profound than her own. She backed away from the door, her heart pounding. She had seen behind the mask, and what she saw was not a monster, but a man in pain. The confusion returned, stronger than ever. Who was he, and why was he so determined to hide himself from the world, and from her? The need to know became a physical ache. The silence between them was no longer just an absence of words. It was a living thing, a barrier she had to break through or be crushed by. She could not live like this, a ghost in a house with another ghost. The next evening at dinner, she did not wait for him to ignore her. As the soup was served, she set down her spoon and looked directly at him, down the long, polished length of the table. "Why?" she asked, her voice clear and steady, though her hands were trembling in her lap. He looked up, his brow furrowed slightly. "I beg your pardon?" "Why did you marry me?" she pressed on, emboldened by his attention. "Do not tell me it was for my dowry, because I had none. Do not tell me it was for my connections, because my family is ruined. I am not a great beauty. I have no particular accomplishments. I am nothing. So why, Your Grace? What was the purpose of this transaction?" He stared at her, his face unreadable. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock. She thought he would not answer, that he would simply rise and leave her there. But instead, he placed his napkin on the table and stood. "Come with me," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Her heart leaped into her throat. She rose and followed him out of the dining hall, through the labyrinth of corridors, to a part of the manor she had never seen. He stopped before a heavy, dust-covered door at the end of a forgotten wing. He produced an old iron key and unlocked it. The hinges groaned in protest as he pushed it open. The room was small and bare, filled with furniture covered in ghostly white sheets. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of moonlight slanting through a grimy window. In the center of the room stood a small, uncovered table. On its surface lay a single object, protected under a glass dome. He led her to the table. He did not speak, simply gestured for her to look. Eleanor peered through the glass. It was a pressed flower, a simple, common wildflower, a bluebell. Its color faded with time, but its delicate shape perfectly preserved. She stared at it, confused. "I don't understand." "Your first season," he said, his voice rough, as if the words were being dragged from him. "The Ashworth's garden party. You wore a white dress, and you had these flowers woven into your hair." The memory came back to her in a dizzying rush. She had been 17, full of nervous hopes. She remembered feeling plain and awkward amidst the confident debutantes. She remembered a flower falling from her hair as she stooped to pat a friendly dog. She had thought it lost. "You were standing by the fountain," he continued, his gaze fixed on the flower, not on her. "You were laughing. A real laugh, not the polite tittering of the others. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I was watching from the shadows of the colonnade. I had been watching you all afternoon." Eleanor's mind reeled. The Duke of Blackwood? At a garden party? Watching her? "I had a reputation, even then," he said, a bitter edge to his voice. "The Iron Duke. Cold. Ruthless. My father had seen to that. He raised me to be an instrument of his ambition, not a man. I knew nothing of laughter or warmth. And then I saw you. You were like sunlight. And I knew that my darkness would only extinguish you." He finally turned to look at her, and his eyes were filled with a raw, agonizing vulnerability she had never imagined possible. The mask was gone. This was Alistair. "So I kept my distance," he whispered. "I watched you from afar, for years. I saw society and its cruelties chip away at your light. I saw them dismiss you, overlook you. I saw you begin to believe you were invisible. And it killed me. I was a coward. I was afraid to approach you, certain I would only bring you misery." He gestured around the dusty room. "This was to be my whole life, alone, with my title, my fortune, and my regrets." Then I heard of your father's ruin, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I heard he was going to sell you to Ashworth, a man I knew to be a degenerate and a brute. The thought of his hands on you, it was more than I could bear. I knew I had to act, but I was still a coward. I didn't know how to court you, how to speak of feelings. I only knew how to command, to transact. So I made your father an offer he couldn't refuse. I thought I could save you, at least. I could give you my name, my protection, my fortune, and leave you in peace. I would rather you hate me in safety than suffer under that man. He looked down at his hands, which were clenched into white-knuckled fists. The marriage contract. It was the only way I knew how to ask. I was buying you, yes, but I was buying you to set you free, not to own you. I never intended to be your husband, only your guardian. Eleanor stood there, speechless. The entire foundation of her world shattered and remade in an instant. The silence, the distance, the separate wings. It hadn't been rejection. It had been a clumsy, misguided attempt at protection. The conservatory, his defense against Lady Isabel, they were not the actions of an owner protecting his property. They were the desperate, silent gestures of a man who had been in love with her for 6 years. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the sight of the lonely man standing before her. She saw it all now. The profound loneliness she had glimpsed through the study door was the cage he had built for himself, because he believed he was a monster who did not deserve the light. She did not think about the years of lost time, of the silent observation that could be seen as unnerving. All she felt was a wave of overwhelming empathy for the boy who had been raised to be an instrument, not a man, and for the man who loved so deeply, but believed himself incapable of expressing it. Slowly, she reached out and laid her hand on his clenched fist. His entire body went rigid at her touch. "You are not a monster, Alistair," she whispered, the name feeling both strange and perfectly right on her tongue. He flinched, his gaze finally meeting hers. Hope and fear warred in his dark eyes. "Eleanor," he breathed, her name a prayer. "All this time," she said, her voice trembling, "I thought I was invisible. I felt like a ghost. But you saw me. You always saw me." A tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. "I saw you too, you know. That day at the garden party. You were so tall and serious. You frightened me. But I never forgot you." A sound escaped his throat, a mix between a sob and a laugh. The tension in his hand eased, and his fingers tentatively intertwined with hers. His touch was no longer cold. It was warm, strong, and shaking slightly. Is it too late?" he asked, his voice raw with a decade of unspoken hope. Eleanor looked at his face, at the man who had loved her from the shadows, who had built her a sanctuary for her art, who had defended her honor with brutal efficiency, and who had married her just to save her from a fate he deemed unworthy. She saw not the Iron Duke, but her Alistair. She shook her head, a slow, deliberate movement. "No," she whispered. "It is not too late." He raised his other hand, his movements hesitant, as if he feared she might vanish. He gently brushed the tear from her cheek, his thumb lingering on her skin. He leaned in, his eyes searching hers for permission. She gave it with a slight nod, her heart hammering not with fear, but with a dizzying, soaring hope. His lips met hers. It was not a kiss of passion or demand, but one of profound, reverent tenderness. It was a question and an answer, a promise and a prayer. It tasted of loneliness and patience, of regret and a new, fragile beginning. In that single, gentle kiss, the walls between them crumbled into dust, and the silence that had defined their lives was finally, blessedly, broken. 1 year later, sunlight streamed through the tall, open windows of Blackwood Manor, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, golden sprites. The white sheets had long been removed from the furniture, and the cavernous rooms were now filled with the scent of lemon polish and fresh flowers from the gardens. The oppressive silence was gone, replaced by the soft rustle of turning pages, the distant clink of teacups, and sometimes the sound of quiet laughter. Eleanor sat in her conservatory, which was now a riot of thriving, exotic life. Her sketchbook lay open in her lap, but she was not drawing. She was watching her husband, who sat in a comfortable wicker chair opposite her, reading aloud from a book of poetry. Alistair was a changed man. The harsh lines of his face had softened, and the guarded, haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by a warm, steady light, especially when he looked at her. He was still a man of few words, but his silence was different now. It was a comfortable, shared silence, born of understanding, not distance. He smiled often, small, private smiles meant only for her. He paused in his reading and looked up, catching her gaze. "What is it?" he asked, his voice a low, pleasant rumble. "I was just thinking," she said, a soft smile playing on her lips. "This house is finally a home." He closed the book, setting it aside. He reached across the small space between them and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. "You made it a home, Eleanor," he said simply. "You brought the sunlight back." It had not been an easy year. Learning to know one another after years of silence and misunderstanding was a delicate, hesitant dance. There were moments of awkwardness, of shy confessions and fumbled attempts at affection. They had to learn how to talk, how to share the small, mundane details of a life together. But beneath it all was the unshakable foundation of his long-held devotion and her growing, deepening love. She had brought life back, not just to the house, but to him. And he, in turn, had given her something she never thought she would have, a place where she was not only seen, but cherished. Her art flourished. Her laughter, the sound he had first fallen in love with, was now a common music in the halls of Blackwood Manor. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I often wonder," he said quietly, his eyes serious, "if you can ever forgive me for the way I began this, for the fear and loneliness I caused you." Eleanor squeezed his hand. "There is nothing to forgive, Alistair. You were a man doing the only thing he knew how to do to protect someone he loved. It was a clumsy beginning, but I wouldn't change it. It brought me here. It brought me to you." She knew that their story was an unusual one, a romance written in silence and secrets. But it was theirs. She had started her journey believing her only choice was what kind of ruin she would inhabit. She had been resigned to a life of invisibility, a pale watercolor fading in the sun. But Alistair, the cold, silent Duke, had seen her in vibrant color all along. He had waited, patiently and foolishly in the shadows, until he could finally step into the light with her. It was never too late to begin again, and their beginning, born from a desperate proposition, had blossomed into a love more real and steadfast than any fairy tale.